Wednesday, January 20th, 2016, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are two of my colleagues, Mike McKean and Stacey Woelfel. On our program this week, time's running out for Al Jazeera America. They called it straight-laced, while others called it boring. Either way, its time is coming to an end in April. We'll look at why the network couldn't break through with American audiences. More on Sean Penn's Rolling Stone interview with El Chapo. He says he's sad about the state of journalism in America. I'll ask our panelists what they think about that. And fired for playing cards on the job. 7 staffers at an Ohio station learned the hard way that what might to them have seemed like an innocent game of cards against humanity can create quite the problem with human resources. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to, but let's start with the freeing of Washington Post reporter Jason Rezaian and a handful of others from Iranian prisons this weekend. It was another case of breaking news on a weekend when few were paying attention or expecting it. Word Saturday morning of a prisoner exchange between the U.S. and Iran. By Sunday, the men were on a plane heading for Switzerland for emotional reunions with family and colleagues. The Washington Post published this video on its website. First, you're going to hear from Rezaian's brother, Ali, and then Washington Post editor Marty Barron.
He was held nearly in solitary confinement. He had one person in the room with him. So it's really going to be a process, not just to get back to spending time with people. I'm thankful for the government, for the U.S. government, all the work that they've done, the support that they've given to get Jason and the other folks on their way home now.
He sounded in very high spirits, very encouraged, wants to see his brother, who's been working tirelessly on his behalf, wants to see us, his professional colleagues, and really craves human contact.
Jason Rezaian sat in the Iranian prison for 545 days. All that time, journalists stateside have been talking about his case, keeping it front of mind. About 10 days ago or so, there was a coalition of news organizations that banded together to appeal to Secretary of State John Kerry to move on all of this, while negotiations were actually ongoing. The Washington Post, Huffington Post, CNN, a bunch of other outlets knew about this. Why'd they decide to sit on the story?
Well, I mean, they said that they were afraid that they could do harm to actual individuals, Jason Rezaian and the other prisoners, if they talked about that. And there was some concern on the part of the negotiators on our side that that was in fact true, that the Iranians would either delay the release or break down the negotiations over the release if the media reported on it too soon.
Teaming up with the government to hold back information always gives me the willies a little bit, but it is pretty easy to see that there could have been some harm, and what was the value of reporting that this was being negotiated versus what if it scuttled the deal and he ended up and the others ended up stuck in there longer. So I'm probably not going to fault anybody too much for sitting on that.
I guess maybe I'm just a little bit concerned about how long they sat on it, because, I mean, theoretically, these negotiations could have been on and off for quite a long time, and there are stories to be told about, what the negotiation process was like. And I guess the other thing that I'm a little worried about, I'm glad about the outcome. Obviously, we all are. Jason Rezaian was not, as far as anyone can tell, being arrested and convicted of anything having to do with spying. It was just he was a bargaining chip. But I wonder if the media that did withhold, Huffington Post, CNN, Washington Post, would have done that for as long as they did it had it not been a journalist who was captive as opposed to the other Iranian Americans who were also there.
Some of that protecting our own a little bit?
Yeah, we see that across the board when there's a tragedy inside a television station or a newspaper that doesn't get reported in the same way that it would outside. And so I think that's always wrong if that's the case. I suspect the people involved here would say, no, we would have done this for anyone.
I think there were a couple of really interesting sort of mysteries that haven't been resolved yet about the release of the various Iranian Americans. For example, there's one person that nobody had ever heard of before, Nosratollah Khosravi Redzari, who decided to stay, we're told, in Iran. We don't know anything about him. Apparently he had no social media profile. You could search him on Google all you like. There's nothing about Who is he? Why was he arrested? When was he arrested? Why did he decide to stay in Iran?
Why did he decide to stay, which would be a frightening prospect for any of the rest of us if we were in that situation.
And the other thing was, it was Bob Levinson, the former FBI agent, who some journalists have reported was actually working for the CIA at the time he was kidnapped several years ago. Others, the government has always denied it. There are reports in some media outlets that our government believes that he died. But for whatever reason, the Iranians have said, well, we'll try to cooperate in finding him. The White House issued a kind of strange statement, last week saying that, well, we don't think he's any longer in Iran. What does that mean? We think he's dead or that he's being held somewhere else? So that's a mystery that I don't know if we'll ever get to the bottom of that.
I think the public here has some perception that the Iranian government knows all and sees all that's going on with these cases, and that might be one to say maybe they really don't know. If we want to take them at their word, maybe they don't have. I think it'd be easy to say they don't have control of every group that might take a hostage in that country.
I'm not sure I would take them at their word. And there is a lot of, as you say, internal politics. There's the government of the president, and then there are the hardliners who are behind the Ayatollah, and who knows what factions are doing what. But something tells me that the Iranians do know what happened to him. It's a question of whether or not, what the timing will be if we'll ever find out about that.
Okay. Last week, we spent a lot of time talking about Sean Penn's Rolling Stone piece on El Chapo and the journalistic and ethical issues with it. Now that Penn's talked about it, what his motivations were and his take on the whole thing, it only seems fair to revisit the topic. He sat down for an interview with Charlie Rose that aired on 60 Minutes Sunday night. Here's a part of it, the part where he gets into talking about journalism and the profession.
What's it been like for you? What are your concerns?
I'll be, as honest as I can be with you about this. I can be very, flamboyant in my words sometimes. I can get angry, like many people can. I'm really sad about the state of journalism in our country. It has been an incredible hypocrisy and an incredible lesson in just how much they don't know and how disserved we are. Of course I know that there are people who don't like me out of the gate, whether it's political.
You're not without controversy.
Not without controversy. Fair enough. Again, journalists who want to say that I'm not a journalist. Well, I want to see the license that says that they're a journalist.
At one point, Sean Penn there using air quotes to talk about journalists. So let me ask and put that question to you. What do you say? What is it that says you're a journalist?
Well, I tried to read his piece. I don't know if you guys did or not. You may have talked about it last week, and so
the 11,000
he could probably
words
use a little journalism school to help with his writing. A little J2100 probably wouldn't hurt there. But no, it's a very good question, and I'm not trying to make fun of him because I'm often sad about the state of journalism, and maybe for some of the same reasons he is. He wanted this piece that he was writing, he says, to help shine light on drug policy and get something done about that. And most mainstream media coverage of drugs is about arrests and prosecution, and it really doesn't look at effectiveness. Yeah, I mean, there are many things we could cover. So I think that's what he's trying to say. Now, what makes me a journalist and him not a journalist, if I want to do it that way? For all of us, it's years of doing this to make a living and publishing things in places where people can read them and recognize news sources. But that's not the only definition. We certainly struggle with that in the new media world in terms of what makes a journalist, and in the documentary world, what makes a journalist.
I guess I would say that while it's true that the sort of day-to-day coverage is around arrests and El Chapo and murders and all of that, but I think that American journalists have done a good job over the years of talking about the war on drugs and its intended and unintended consequences. The fact that we have so many young black men in prison because of crack as opposed to powder cocaine. All those stories have been covered. The reason that he failed, as he admitted in this interview with Charlie Rose, in telling that bigger story is not because he's not a journalist. I mean, the reason he failed is that the American people have a very complicated relationship to record recreational drugs. And maybe we don't want to admit what the problem or the solution is to it, not because the media aren't covering it well enough. I mean, he did make one point that I agree with him on. Show me the license for anybody being a journalist. We don't license journalists in the United States, and I'm glad we don't license journalists. But what he did probably wasn't the most effective journalism, because he went in there with some blinders on about how you kiss up to somebody who is responsible for the murders of many, many people.
Well, and one of the points with that, too, the idea that he gave El Chapo editorial approval on the story. You know, one of the things in my mind, too, that makes a journalist is the adherence to some of those codes of ethics that we have out there. The Journalist Creed that Walter Williams wrote, the Society of Professional Journalists, RTDNA's Code of Ethics. And according to those codes of ethics, you wouldn't give your primary source editorial control to either approve or disapprove of the publication of the story, which is the next thing they talk about in that clip. You can watch the full thing on our links blog.
The codes of ethics, which are great, and I subscribe to them wholly, but they are two-edged swords in that most journalists are not perfect, and when they do something that runs afoul of those codes of ethics, people like Sean Penn and others are quick to say, aha, see, you don't even follow your own codes of ethics. And so that's part of the issue that we have here.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this last week, and I understand the argument that he's making and Rolling Stone was making. It really wasn't that he had control over how the story was going to be played, but whether it got played or not. At least that's what they claim. And just to say one good thing about Sean Penn in this whole interview in the story, when he said one thing to Charlie Rose that I think is really true, not talking about himself and El Chapo, but the Americans and El Chapo. And he said, like it or not, we're married to him. And I think that's probably true.
It's a good point. But as you think about it, and as I watched that interview, I would have much rather seen Charlie Rose interview El Chapo than Sean Penn. And that goes to the conception of what was the story going to be. I don't think Sean probably had a great notion of what the story is. I think Charlie Rose or a heck of a lot of other journalists would have a story in mind when they went in there.
Of course, Charlie Rose probably would have never gotten that interview, and it's probably true that neither would Sean Penn if it hadn't have been for the Mexican actress, because what we've heard coming out lately is that he didn't even know who Sean Penn was.
He was more interested in the actress from the telenovela.
Right.
Well, so as we have this discussion about Sean Penn and asking who or what identifies a journalist, legislation has been proposed in South Carolina that would create requirements for people who want to work in that state as a journalist. The full text of Republican Mike Pitts' bill isn't available yet, but the summary indicates that it would require the establishment of a responsible journalism registry. Now, there is zero chance that this bill is going to go anywhere. That has been made perfectly clear, but it still does have some interesting points that are worth discussing. There's the question of the constitutionality of it, the idea of Congress or the government as a whole creating or making no law to restrict the freedom of the press. But Pitt says he's not limiting freedom. He's simply calling for responsibility.
Not unlike what I just talked about with the codes of ethics. This legislator seems to have a little bit of an axe to grind. It looks like probably he didn't like some stories that he's been involved in, and so this is a way for him to get back. But it's not a totally unheard of sentiment among the public. I did a stint for a couple of years as the national chairman of the Radio, Television, Digital News Association, and more than once I got a call from an irate viewer who had a reporter that he was unhappy with and wanted to know, who basically licensed these reporters, and thought that maybe our organization did that, and was very disappointed when I said that we didn't do that we did have a code of ethics, but we didn't license people or give them some sort of approval to be reporters. And so the public is looking for some accountability on the part of reporters that they think do a bad job. In his case, it's probably political, but that's not the case with everybody.
Yeah, and his motives, we would cover a story if somebody introduced an important piece of legislation, regardless of what their political motivation was. His motivation is kind of interesting. I mean, the newspaper that reported on this in their lead sentence talks about how he tried to keep the Confederate battle flag flying, and he was the subject of an investigative piece by their newspaper. He was mad.
Have some interesting
mad at folks about journalists demonizing gun ownership. Okay, it doesn't matter. matter. If he's proposing a bill that could have some serious consequences, maybe we should talk about it. But I do wonder sometimes, and this happens not just in South Carolina, but with legislative coverage around the country, when do we report on something that has no chance of ever being passed? Why do we do that?
Which is a very valid conversation. It's actually one that I had with several people via Facebook yesterday, kind of sending me a link to this story and saying, you're going to talk about this on the show tomorrow. And my first thought, and this goes back to conversations that I've had with Ryan Famuliner, who is the news director here at KBIA, and the idea of when you know you have a legislator who is proposing legislation, who has a bill out there that they're sponsoring simply for the sake of making a headline, for grabbing some part of the news cycle, a bill like this one that's going to never go anywhere. Do you cover it, or do you let it go because all you're doing is pandering to what they're looking for?
When I was the news director at KOMU, we would struggle with this because so many bills are filed in Jefferson City that are never going to get out of committee if they even get brought up in the committee. And so I think there are a lot we don't do. I think there's some value in doing that because we know that this lawmaker, when it's time for re-election, is going to run about how he, stood up for the people of South Carolina against out-of-state media or whatever he's going to say about it. And if we shine a little light on that earlier, at least voters are a little more informed about what that was really about.
Sometimes I think that's true. Sometimes I think that, and not just young student reporters, but a lot of other reporters are just kind of naive about the whole process. If they were covering the legislature on a regular basis, they would know what determines whether something is likely to go through or not. And so is it just naivete? Maybe. Is it just we're curious, or this is a sensational story, or it's a slow news day, or something? I don't know. I mean, I think the only legitimate reason to cover a story like this one is if you think, well, maybe there's a chance, and we just need to pound in the last nail in the coffin. But otherwise, I don't think there's a real reason to cover a story like that.
So this next topic that we're going to talk about actually has to do with a bill that is moving forward in a state legislature. We had been talking a few months ago about a handful of them winding their way through state legislatures across the country, trying to limit the availability of video being obtained through police body cameras. There has been some movement this week in the state of Indiana on the issue. Stacey, you brought this one up and wanted to talk about it. Talk a little bit about what's gone on there in the past week or so.
So the state legislature there is considering putting limits on the availability of the body cams that police wear, that there would have to be, you'd have to give a reason why it should be released, or that they could give a reason why it shouldn't be released. And I mean, I think it's outrageous, frankly, and RTDNA, which we've mentioned a couple of times, is leading some of the national attention on this, because the whole reason to have body cams is to record all the time and have that available so that the public and investigators can find out what went on, and the cameras can help do that. So if suddenly we say, well, the media can't have it unless we say so, that's a free ticket to hide the worst offenses.
It's backwards to me. I mean, what we should have is a situation where if police are going to wear the body cameras, and I think there are lots of reasons why they should, and the dashboard cameras that they've been using for a long time, well, then it's the police department's duty to describe why they're not going to release it, not to have the presumption that we have to demand that it be released, and we have to go to court if the police decide not to release it. I mean, look at the Laquan McDonald case in Chicago. This is exactly
taking more than a year for that video to become public.
So you have to say, if you're going to do that, and I agree, you have to set a very high bar to withhold it, and it would probably have to, in my mind, be more than protecting the police. It would have to somehow be protecting other people.
And that the video should rise to the same standard as any other public document.
Absolutely.
That it's a digital document.
I mean, there was one part of the legislation, and I think this is probably the cover under which folks who support, keeping police from having to release this video are using, and that's that there are legitimate concerns about police with body cameras going into, say, a private residence or a place where somebody who's not accused of a crime is being shown without their permission. I can understand that. What I can't understand is saying, even if you're going to restrict this, which I think we all agree should not happen, restrict it to the victim and to their family or their lawyer, this law wouldn't even allow them to have a copy of the video. We could show it to you a couple of times and then never make it available for you to parse and see what's really going on in detail.
And show to the people that we represent in the first place. There are ways to protect innocent people. If we get doing a FOIA request and get documents back, often names are redacted, and you can redact video. It's not expensive equipment anymore to do that.
So let's talk about Al Jazeera America. When it first launched 2 years ago, it looked so promising, so refreshing.
Quality journalism, dedicated reporting, and unbiased coverage. Al Jazeera America.
Fearlessness is being ready, it's being bold, it's an attitude.
Fearless means asking the questions that no one else is asking.
And it's being there.
And it tried, but come April, its attempt at bringing nonpartisan, straightforward cable news will be over. Some people called it boring. It's like we need to have screaming talking heads for our news to be interesting. What's really happening here? Why isn't it connecting with the American audience?
Its name, for one thing, has always been a problem for it. We have a couple of our alums that I know that work there and do great journalism. Maybe they're putting together good stories, good newscasts, and they work in a couple of different parts of the company. But that name makes it tough, and I don't think it's available on any of our cable outlets here, right?
I know that's one of the issues I have is
it.
I don't have it on Mediacom. My parents had it on or still do for a few months on Comcast in a different part of the country.
Well, actually, it is available even in this market, at least in some carriers. But the difference is that unlike it being part of a package, a premium package or whatever, if you want Al Jazeera America, you have to pay for it separately. For example, I subscribed to it because I just wanted to see what it was like and to be able to talk about it on this show. And I have to pay $5 a month to CenturyLink on top of what I pay for my package in order to get that. So that's a high hurdle for people to cross, even if you get past the name and the bias that a lot of people associate with that. The other problem that you have, frankly, is that they had some of their own controversy. They shot themselves in the foot lately. Lawsuits or over discrimination and the treatment of women, allegations of bias against Israel. So there are problems there. But I think the bigger issue is just that nobody has figured out how to play television news 24 hours a day down the middle of the road and win with that. Fox News wins because they've got their partisan audience. MSNBC, although they've made some changes, had their audience. CNN has waffled back and forth between being just straight news to doing documentaries and sort of other kinds of branded content to try to make money. I don't know that anybody right now in our kind of hyper partisan society can win by driving down the middle.
Yeah, I'm not sure the network had a great business plan going in. When it started, I thought maybe it was a bit of a vanity project and that they didn't mind if they lost money, and maybe that was the case. And maybe somebody changed his or her mind and said, we do mind if we lose money and we're not going to do it anymore.
It was, they didn't have a business model. Their business model was that the government and the royal family of Qatar will prop it up until and when, if it ever makes any money from advertising or subscriptions. So that's not a model that could have lasted very long.
Okay, so the next topic that I want to bring up, it's one that's led to a lot of conversation in media circles. And interestingly enough, that conversation has sounded different depending on the age of the people talking. Let me tell you what happened, and then maybe it'll become apparent why people of different generations see this one differently. New Year's Day. It's a rough one to work in a newsroom. Once you do the story of the first baby born, there's usually little else to report. It's too cold for parades, and most people are holed up watching football. So a group of staffers at WTOL-TV in Toledo decided to pass the time playing a game of Cards Against Humanity. If you've never played the game, it's kind of like the kids' game, Apples to Apples. There are parts of sentences on cards, and you try to come up with the best sentence by pairing up cards. Only this game isn't for children. It's sexual. It's raunchy. And the 2 times I played it, I couldn't believe the words coming out of my mouth or out of my friends' mouths. So we don't know all of the details here. Station management wouldn't comment on personnel matters, but 7 staffers who played the game in the newsroom on New Year's Day, they don't work there anymore. All 7 of them fired. So as a firm Gen Xer, I have to say, whoa, who would ever think to take a game like that into a work environment? But a lot of 20-somethings I'm talking to, they're seeing this as management overreacting. It's the fun police overreaching.
I've never played the game, but reading the descriptions, I can't see that it's appropriate for a workplace. I'm happy to say that Jim Reek likes to run a game of Name That Tune on the weekends or on the holidays, so that's a much better way to spend your time. Yeah. But it's just not appropriate, and so it didn't go out on the air. That's the thing. Did it go out on the air? No, it didn't go out on the air. But there were probably some people who were uncomfortable, who maybe weren't playing the game or maybe did play the game out of peer pressure, who were uncomfortable with the subject matter.
I feel so old. I'd never even heard of this game until you brought it up, let alone having played it.
Ask your daughters.
It didn't go out on the air. It didn't get posted on social media that I know about, but and was the punishment right? I don't know if firing them was right, but I have to agree with Stacey. I think it's inappropriate to be playing that game in a work environment like that. It could be perceived by some as harassment. There's lots of other things about it that are just legally and professionally not very sound.
Okay, quickly, we have a couple of minutes to get this topic in. February 28th, all eyes will be turning to Hollywood for the Academy Awards. And as of the time we're sitting here talking about this, Chris Rock will host the telecast. But there's pressure on him to join a growing boycott over the lack of diversity in this year's pool of nominees. Jada Pinkett Smith is leading the charge for actors, directors, and producers of color to simply stay home that night.
Here's what I believe. The Academy has the right to acknowledge whomever they choose, to invite whomever they choose. And now I think that it's our responsibility now to make the change. Maybe it is time that we pull back our resources and we put them back into our communities, into our programs, and we make programs for ourselves that acknowledge us in ways that we see fit, that are just as good as the so-called mainstream ones.
And that issues of diversity at the Academy Awards have come up. Back in 1996, Jesse Jackson called for a boycott. What can really be done? It's not as though at this point the nominees are going to change.
No, it won't change. I mean, it's a systemic problem, and a number of actors and others in Hollywood have called out and said this is a problem with who's getting hired, who's making films, and where the ideas are coming from. So the attention probably will help, and I expect the Academy will probably make some changes after this.
I think there's a structural problem in that we have a lot of people with lifetime memberships. The Academy's average age is 62 or something like that, and overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. That's what's going to happen until that structure changes.
Interestingly enough, the president of the Academy is an African-American woman as well, and she's calling for sweeping changes.
Right. She comes in, and she's been there not a terribly long time, I think, and so she probably has the power to do that. But it's got a governing board, it's got a number of people, and so she's got to turn the Titanic, that's my movie reference there, to try to make some changes. And membership would be one. Membership in the Academy, because not everybody gets to vote. Very few people do.
What are the
core
qualifications in order to get into people to vote?
It's lengthy, longer than we have to go into, and
okay.
But it does tend to favor these older, whiter demographics.
Okay, well, we're out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about on our links blog. You can find that under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave us comments, questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, to Maya Jackson, she's our technical director, and KBIA's Pat Akers handled the audio for us today. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.